So we will have a little look at a past paper question. Now, it is not an AQA past paper question, it is an Edexcel past paper question. And the reason I've done that is because this is just, I think, one of the best questions on national debt, fiscal deficit I have seen, in terms of helping students sort of run through some of the concepts, see some actual data, understand the data. AQA, well, you see when we get to the question, AQA don't ask questions like this, so do not view this as a way to practice or learn exam technique for an AQA question. It's not that. It's just that I thought this question would be helpful for sort of bringing everything together, applying actual data, and thinking about how some of these concepts relate. So, okay, what we've got here, figure 4, UK national debt as a percentage of GDP. And I think you can kind of see sort of the economic cycle maybe reflected a bit here. So you can see in the 90s, the national debt is increasing. And that, again, kind of makes sense. There was a bit of a kerfuffle in the early 90s with the dot-com bubble I talked about earlier. Then national debt starts to decrease. Then you've got 2008, and look at what happens there. And this obviously exam dates from a few years ago, 2015, where the national debt was predicted to decrease. So again, think about kind of what I've been discussing with regards to the economic cycle earlier. Crisis, your national debt increases, but then as you recover, which we did until 2008, then you can bring that debt down. Then you have another crisis in 2008, national debt increases. But people expected, eventually, things will turn around. It might be taking a while this time, that we've got 2008 to 2015, or 7 years of increasing national debt. The government brought in austerity around 2010 as well to try and decrease the national debt. So they're expecting it to decrease. But can anyone tell me roughly, as a percentage of GDP, where is the UK's current national debt if we fill in this forecasted period to show what's actually happened? What might we see in the chat, please? So it was forecast to fall from about 80% of GDP to about 70% in 2020. What has actually happened? Anybody? Oh, wait, no problem. I think you should. Yes, Niantic, thank you. Yes. This is something I've mentioned before, but this is also something I've mentioned before. Obviously, these figures change all the time, so the best thing to do is to get specific figures like a couple months before your exams and just use those figures for your exams. But the national debt right now is roughly 100% of GDP, and I wouldn't expect it to change much more. So Niati's given the figure of 97. Like, if I'm an examiner and I saw 97, I'm marking that as correct, because whilst it might have changed in the last month to 98.2 or whatever, it's around 100%. Okay, so what has actually happened is like that. Okay, this did not happen. This forecast failed to happen. What's actually happened is it's gone up, and that angle is probably a bit more severe though, like that, because of COVID. So there's this, again, quite interesting in terms of what I was saying earlier. The expectation after the crisis would be that you have higher growth and a boom, and then national debt goes down. But what's actually happened is the economy has plateaued and national debt has increased. And then we had another crisis, of course. So, okay, let's see what else we've got on the menu with this data. So, figure 5, UK fiscal deficit, which is also just known as the public sector net borrowing, because you have to borrow to cover a deficit. So this is like the marginal, right? This is not showing you the total debt. This is just showing you year by year how much did the government have to borrow or how much did they overspend. that year. So again, you can see like 90s, early 90s, growing fiscal deficit, but then as the economy improves, and then we've got again a big fall that peaks in 2009. So the deficit was, I mean, just look at this. Like after your 1990s hiccup, you've got a deficit of minus what 55 maybe billion at the world. And then 2009, straight after the financial crisis, we're now talking like 150 billion. So in the space of 15 years, the peak of the deficit has tripled. That is absolutely insane, right? Then after 2009, you've got a bit of a recovery, and then it's forecast that whilst at the time of writing in 2015, the deficit was minus 80 billion, it was forecast that this would keep shrinking and that eventually there would be a surplus around 2019, 2020. Any guesses as to whether that has indeed happened? Yes, no, possibly. I don't know. But yeah, it has not happened. I will cut that one out for you guys early. It has not happened. Still got fiscal deficits and therefore a bit of a problem. We'll ignore that one because it's not relevant for the question I wanted to look at. So here we go. Where the references to figure 4 and 5 examine the relationship between the national debt as a proportion of GDP and the fiscal deficit. Now, I am going to put that in the chat. Hopefully you can all see it so that I can scroll up. Please let me know if you can't see it so that I can scroll up and look at these figures whilst you have the question in front of you, basically. Can we get them both on one page? Not really. Okay, it's fine. So with reference to figures 4 and 5, what is the relationship between the national debt as a proportion of GDP and the fiscal deficit? So again, it's not an AQA question. The point here is not really to talk about, how do you get full marks on this question, but just to explore this relationship. What is the relationship between national debt as a proportion of GDP and the fiscal deficit? So can someone tell me, based on what I said right at the start, much simpler. In fact, we'll put this in the chat as well. What is the relationship between the national debt and the fiscal deficit? It might look like the same question. So hopefully you can all see I've put two questions in the chat, the actual question and my own question. You might be thinking, it's the same. It's not the same question. It's not the same question. Can anyone see there's a very important difference? And can anyone answer the second question, which is much easier? No, maybe. It's like back of the cereal packets. What the difference between two pictures? It's like the same thing. It's a slightly less childish version, right? You've got one question, you've got another question. Spot the difference. What is the difference? And can you answer the second question? Should be very, very brief. Oh, you guys, it's just okay. Thank you. Someone's just told me you cannot see the question. Okay. Very useful knowledge that. Thank you. I remember I watched one of the YouTube videos and like part of the board was cut out and no one said oh, you're drawing a diagram that we can't see, and I was like, oh, okay guys, hopefully you can all see this, right? I've just in case, because it sounds like some people can see it in the chat, some people can't. So I've put it here. So that is the actual question, the first bit, this bigger question, and then the second one is mine. So the idea is, can you spot the difference between the two questions, and can you answer the second question? So Niati has an excuse because you couldn't see it, but those of you who are telling me you can see it, where's my answer? Where is my answer? What is the difference between these questions? And what is the answer to the second question? I can't wait forever because I am running out of coffee. Okay, no takers. No takers. No one can see any difference between these two questions other than the bit at the top. Of course, yeah. Mine doesn't say with reference to figures 4 and 5. But I thought I thought that was the really easy part. What is the difference between these two questions? Um, but again, no takers, nobody. Thank you, Niati. Are we just if Niati wasn't here, honestly. Honestly. Okay, thank you everyone else. Follow the leader. That's the spirit. See, it's like price leaders in collusion. Anyway. So the first brings in this proportion of GDP, which makes it more difficult, right? Look very carefully. What is the relationship between the national debt as a proportion of GDP and the fiscal deficit? Mine does not ask that. It just says, what is the relationship between the national debt and the fiscal deficit? To which a good answer would be, anybody, what is the relationship between the national debt and the fiscal deficit? I'm not looking for more than one or two lines here. It could be very simple. In fact, if you gave me a definition of national debt, you'd probably be on the money if you think about it. Devian says the larger the fiscal deficit, the larger the national debt. You'd get some credit for that. Like, let's say you're actually doing this. I like Mira's a little more. She said consecutive fiscal deficit leads to national debt. Yes, Devian, much nicer. National debt is the accumulation of fiscal deficits, right? That is the definition of national debt. Is the accumulation of fiscal deficits. Was a very easy way to explain that to the examiner. Well, we could do it mathematically. We could say to the examiner, for example, if a country has a fiscal deficit of X, its national debt will increase by X. If a country has a fiscal surplus of Y, its national debt will decrease by Y. So the national debt is just the accumulation or the sum of consecutive fiscal deficits. So very nice and simple. And you basically want to get across the idea that the fiscal deficit is what is added to the national debt, right? Or the fiscal deficit means you have to borrow money to cover that deficit, which is where your national debt comes from. So there's a number of different ways you can do it, but this second question should be very easy. And this first question does make it a bit more challenging. And again, that's kind of what I wanted to talk about here. So if we're just looking at the relationship between national debt and the fiscal deficit, again, please tell me in the chat. Let's take 2015, for example. So 2015, what is the fiscal deficit? It is, let's say, minus 65 billion. Okay. So if there is a deficit of minus 65 billion, what's going to happen to the national debt in 2015? Is it going to go up? Is it going to go down? And how much is it going to go up or down by? So there's a fiscal deficit of minus 65 billion. What should happen to the total national debt? In the chat, please. Think about if you have a deficit of 65 billion, how much do you have to borrow? And therefore, what happens to the national debt? So I've got go down by 65 billion. We got agreement there. The national debt in this case will go down by 65 billion. Goes up by 65 billion. That sounds more likely. Yes. So again, if anyone was slightly confused there, you've got to remember deficit means you have to borrow, which increases your debt. Surplus means you have extra money, extra cash. You can pay off your debt. So in this case, we've got a deficit. You're going to need to borrow 65 billion. So the national debt in this case will increase by 65 billion. And for EdXL students, this is one of the ways they go answer this question, is to take a specific point in the data and say, in 2015, there was a deficit of 65 billion, which means factually, if we ignore interest rates, the national debt will increase by 65 billion. Because again, the fiscal deficit is basically how much the public sector has to borrow each year. 65 billion, there we go. So national debt will increase 65 billion. So then if we go up to this graph, you might see a bit of the problem here. So we've got a fiscal deficit in 2015, and we've still got a fiscal deficit in 2016 and 2017. But what was predicted to happen to the national debt in 2016, 2017? And why is that weird? So you had a fiscal deficit, let me remind you, you've got a fiscal deficit just seen, minus 65 billion in 2015. Still got a deficit in 2016, still got a deficit in 2017. What's happening to the national debt here, and why is that weird? Yeah, and in the chat, I know I'm leaning heavily on you guys today, but just kind of check to see if it's getting through. Good. Mira says national debt is decreasing. That is indeed correct. Or national debt as a proportion of GDP is decreasing. Why is that weird given figure 5? Like, why doesn't this quite line up with figure 5? 2016, 2017, national debt is decreasing. Figure 5, 2016, 2017, we have a fiscal deficit. Looks like in 2017, the fiscal deficit is minus 15 billion. So why am I saying this graph might look weird to some people, especially if they don't consider the percentage of GDP part? What do we expect to happen? Good, Niati, well done. What do we expect to happen? As I was saying, when you have a fiscal deficit, we expect national debt to increase. Good. Well done again, Mira. Well done. So yes, exactly. When we have a fiscal deficit, we expect national debt to be increasing. So 2015 to 2017, national debt should increase by 65 billion in 2015. Then in 2016, it looks like it should increase by about 50 billion. 2017, they got it down quite a lot. Maybe it increases by 20 billion, but it should be increasing. So why is it decreasing here? And this is what made this question really difficult. This was a low scoring question. EdXL is normally, as I'm sure I've said before, normally like the easiest of the exam boards, but this was a very difficult question for them. It was all about this. It is, yes, again, what Amira is, it's all about this percentage of GDP point. And I just want to see again if any of you guys can work this out and can really break it down for me mathematically. I'll obviously do so afterwards, but I'm interested. Can you work that out mathematically? What must be happening, or what must be predicted to happen for the debt to GDP to be falling, even though the fiscal deficit, as we can see here, it's rising. Mira, you are so close. So Mira said GDP is increasing. Niati, as I think, pinned it down. GDP has got to be increasing at a faster rate than the national debt. Okay, and that was well done, Devin. Yes, well done. So this was the key to unlocking full marks for this question on EdXL, which was what made it very, very difficult. Is that typically, I think this sort of one thing as a proportion of another in macro tends to be a bit confusing for students. Anything to do with like real, which is the same thing, like that is inflation. What is the inflation rate as a proportion of the increase in income or the increase in GDP? Similar kind of problem. And I think very, very few people kind of really got specific here and said, well, look, Mr. Examiner, we've got a fiscal deficit. That is clear. We've got a fiscal deficit in 2016. It looks like it's like, let's say, minus 50 billion. So the total national debt should be increasing by 50 billion. But of course, figure 4 does not show us total national debt. It shows us, as we can see on the y-axis, debt as a percentage of GDP. So for the debt as a percentage of GDP to be falling, even whilst we are borrowing more money, it must be because, say, we are borrowing 4% more, but GDP has grown by 5% or 6%, or we were borrowing 10% more, but GDP has grown by 12 or 13%. Then even though the national debt is rising, because the GDP is rising faster, like think of it maybe at first, national debt is here, GDP is here, maybe the national debt is like half of the GDP. And then if the national debt goes up a little bit, but the GDP goes up loads, maybe it's now only a third or a quarter of the national debt, right? So very well done, Niati Davimira. It's basically, it must be that GDP has been increasing faster than the national debt has been increasing. Okay, the timing ended up being almost perfect here. I will say, as a sort of final note, one of the other reasons I picked this question is because this is a really good area of evaluation for the national debt essay that we'll discuss next week as well. Is how big is the debt relative to GDP? That's a really important point. The other one that will come up again next week that we talked about today is external debt. So the difference between what we call domestic debt and external